Our next speaker is Theodora Pappas. She goes by Teddi, T-E-D-D-I, Teddi. She's a criminal defense lawyer with a BA in political science from the University of Texas at Austin from 1991. Excuse me. And also a JD from the University of Memphis in 1994. She's been fascinated by the Shroud since age 15. She has been intensely studying the Shroud for 4.5 years. She's a moderator for the Shroud Science Group, which is an online Shroud group of about 150 people. There's actually two groups, Shroud Science and Shroud Science 1. And she's appeared on podcasts. She's started to publish in peer-reviewed journals. And she's currently writing a book for Professor Fonte's series on Christian relics. It will be on the blood of the Shroud and kind of debunking the late Dr. Walter McCrone. She is a stickler for details, and let's welcome Teddi Pappas.
Good morning, everybody. Well, we're going to be talking about evidence for the divinity of Christ and how the Holy Shroud is what I think the very best evidence and confirmation for it. So, C.S. Lewis issued the following warning to all of us. He said, "I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing that we must not say. A man who is merely a man and said the sort of things that Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level of the man who says that he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up as a fool. You can spit at him and call him as a demon. Or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord God." So Lewis leaves us with a trilemma. Is Jesus of Nazareth a liar, a lunatic, or Lord? Let's take a look at some of the evidence. But in order to properly assess the evidence, it's critical that we evaluate it in its proper context. Context is everything. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John provide us with the most extensive and expansive information concerning the life, death, resurrection, and ultimately the divinity of Jesus of Nazareth. These four Gospels are comfortably dated from the manuscript evidence to the 1st century, and they fall within the genre of historical Greco-Roman biographies. Even New Testament scholar Dr. Bart Ehrman, a self-professed atheist, very firmly defends the four Gospels as historical sources of information which, among other things, as he says, and I quote, "make a convincing case that Jesus really existed." He goes on to say, "The idea that Jesus did not exist is a modern notion. It has no ancient precedents. It was made up in the 18th century. One might call it a modern myth. The myth of the mythological Jesus. As Ehrman points out, we don't dismiss early American accounts of the Revolutionary War simply because they were written by Americans. We take their biases into consideration, but we do not refuse to use them as historical sources. Ehrman goes on to say that to dismiss the Gospels from the historical record is neither fair nor scholarly, and that Luke's writings about Jesus carry no more or less weight than the writings of other ancient biographers. And he lists Suetonius and Plutarch as examples. However, what Ehrman says is not quite an accurate comparison, because Luke's work as a biographer is even more reliable than at least some of Suetonius and Plutarch's work. Why? Because, for example, Suetonius was writing about Julius Caesar in 121 AD in his work, The 12 Caesars, when Julius Caesar died around 165 years earlier in 44 BC. However, moreover, Plutarch, who wrote his famous historical biographical work, Parallel Lives, around 110 AD, wrote a historical account about Alexander the Great, who died 433 years before in 323 BC. What elevates the biographies about Jesus by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is that they were all contemporaneously written when people were still living who could remember Jesus. These people had no motive to lie regarding what they said. So additionally, the gospel writers were in a position to know whether or not what they were writing about was true. They had absolutely no incentive to write lies about Jesus, since there was never even any potential for fame, fortune, or social advantage in being a Christian. Instead, they knew that being a Christian was something that resulted in persecution and sometimes even martyrdom for themselves as well as their families. So what did the gospel writers report to us about Jesus? The Gospels report that Jesus claimed to be both the Messiah and divine. Before we look at some examples, let's clarify some things. Christians believe that Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah, and Christians believe that Jesus is also God. Yet, as Bart said, the Jewish concept of the Messiah was that of a special emissary sent by God to do some sort of special work here on earth. We know that under God-derived Mosaic law, the Jews were commanded to execute anyone who blasphemed the name of the Lord. But what exactly is blasphemy? Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish contemporary of Jesus, described blasphemy as the words of any man who has dared to compare himself to the all-blessed God. So now, let's look at what the Gospels inform us about what Jesus claimed about himself. In John's Gospel, a woman said to Jesus that she knew that the Messiah, the one called Christ, is coming. And Jesus responded to her, I, the one speaking to you, am he. Additionally, John tells us that Jesus proclaimed to the Jews that he, just like the Father, has the power to raise the dead and to give life to anyone that he wishes to. Then Jesus went on to say that the Father judges no one, and he stated that everyone may honor him as God the Father's Son, just as they honor the Father, and that whoever does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. Additionally, John tells us that Jesus claimed to have the power to give his followers eternal life, and he proclaimed, "I and the Father are one." John says that Jews picked up stones to stone Jesus, and they explicitly tell him that they are going to stone him because he, a man, is making himself God. In Luke's gospel, Jesus said, "Man, your sins are forgiven you." Then the scribes and the Pharisees begin to question, saying, "Who is this who speaks blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God alone?" And additional evidence can be found in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. So as we can very clearly see, Jesus did not merely compare himself to God. No, no, no. Jesus very clearly put himself in an equal position of power and importance to God. So, with Jesus saying these things, he either had to be a diabolical liar, a lunatic, or Lord. The four Gospels recount how Jesus made the following claims: that in Jerusalem he was going to be betrayed, delivered into the hands of men, rejected, and that he would suffer many things from the elders, chief priests, and scribes, which were the three groups that comprised the Sanhedrin, that they would then kill him, and that on the third day he would be raised again. Additionally, in Matthew, we are told that the chief priests and the Pharisees remembered hearing Jesus claim that after 3 days from his death, he will rise again. And as such, they asked Pilate to secure Jesus' tomb until the third day in order to prevent Jesus' disciples from stealing his body and telling people that he has been raised from the dead. Additionally, in Matthew, the chief priests and the Pharisees asked Pilate to mount a guard at Jesus' tomb because they were afraid that Jesus' followers would steal the body and claim that he had risen from the dead. Matthew points out that they wanted this done because they remembered that when Jesus was alive, he had taught his disciples that he would rise again in 3 days. And also, in Matthew's gospel, we are told that the third time that Jesus predicted his death was as he was speaking to his disciples and they were heading up toward Jerusalem for Passover. Jesus specifically told them how he would be mocked, scourged, crucified, and then rise again. And Luke's account of Jesus' third prediction of his death as they were all going to Jerusalem together was, Jesus took the 12 aside and told them, "We are going up to Jerusalem, and everything that is written by the prophets about the Son of Man will be fulfilled. He will be delivered over to the Gentiles. They will mock him, insult him, and spit on him. They will flog him and kill him. On the third day, he will rise again." These are all very specific, repeated claims by Jesus. Again, is he a liar, a lunatic, or Lord? With regard to supernatural occurrences, Jesus performs miracles. The canonical Gospels don't just tell us of Jesus' claims about himself. No. They tell us that Jesus performed over 37 miracles in front of various witnesses. Matthew's Gospel reports the following about what the Pharisees believed about Jesus. Then they brought to him a demon-possessed man who was blind and mute. Jesus healed him so that he could speak and see. All the crowds were amazed and said, "Could this one be the son of David?" But when the Pharisees heard this, they said, "He does not cast out demons except by the power of Beelzebul, the ruler of demons." Additionally, in the Babylonian Talmud, Jesus is said by the Jews to have practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. So the Jews were convinced that Jesus had supernatural powers, but they believed that his powers were demonically derived. Origen was an early Christian scholar and theologian who lived back during the 2nd and 3rd century. In his famous work against Celsus, he refutes attacks made by Celsus, who is a 2nd century Greek philosopher and opponent of early Christianity. Origen specifies to people where they can read Celsus's and Phlegon's unwitting admissions concerning Jesus' supernatural abilities with regard to knowledge of future events, and that Jesus' predictions came true. Origen wrote the following about Celsus in Against Celsus. Celsus, however, accepting or granting that Jesus foreknew what would befall him, might think to make light of that admission, as he did in the case of the other miracles, when he alleged that they may have been wrought by means of sorcery. For he might say that many persons by means of divination, either by auspices or auguries or sacrifices or nativities, have come to the knowledge of what was to happen. But this concession he would not make, as being too great a one. And although he somehow granted that Jesus worked miracles, he thought to weaken the force of this by the charge of sorcery. Now, Phlegon, in the 13th or 14th book, I think, of his Chronicles, not only ascribed to Jesus a knowledge of future events, but also testified that the results corresponded with his predictions. The Transfiguration. Regarding Jesus' transfiguration, Matthew, Mark, and Luke give the account of how Jesus took John, James, and Peter up a mountain to pray. As Jesus was praying on the mountain, we were informed that suddenly Jesus' face shone like the sun. His garments suddenly became as white as the light. And Moses and Elijah appeared and were talking with Jesus. And then a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." And when the disciples heard this, they fell to their faces, and they were filled with awe. Jesus then told them to rise and have no fear. And then they lifted up their eyes and saw only Jesus. And as they were all coming down from the mountain, Jesus commanded them, "Tell no one of this vision until the Son of God, until the Son of Man is raised from the dead." Jesus' transfiguration in front of John, James, and Peter while on the mountain is of great importance in that it was an overt display of Jesus' divinity, and Jesus once again foretold of his death and resurrection. First, Jesus appeared to them with a supernatural appearance in the way that his face shone like the sun, and his clothes suddenly glistened and became supernaturally bright and white. Second, they heard the voice from the cloud, and strangely this overshadowed them. And then we have the supernatural appearance of Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus, and the very powerful message contained in this about who Jesus is. Because after all, Moses and Elijah are the only two people in the Old Testament to climb a mountain to commune with God. And here, during the transfiguration of Jesus, Moses and Elijah appear to once again commune with God. With regard to Jesus' face being described as having shone like the sun, one has to wonder if this energy coming from Jesus' face is the same energy that resurrected him and formed the body image on the shroud. In discussing this observation of mine with Jack Marquardt, he made the interesting comment that the transfiguration of Jesus might have been presaging the transfiguration of his clean burial shroud to one that then had the addition of his body image on it. The supernatural darkness at crucifixion. Let us examine the darkness at Jesus' crucifixion in its full context, particularly within the symbolism of the repeating threes, which point to the Holy Trinity. There's a strong evidence that Jesus was executed at age 33 on April 3rd of the year 33. He was nailed to the cross at 9 a.m., and the number 9 consists of 3 threes. After Jesus was hanging on the cross for 3 hours, there was a supernatural darkness that lasted for 3 hours and ended at 3 p.m. And on the third day, Jesus rises from the dead. And in addition to this beautiful barrage of Trinitarian symbolism, it concludes with a very strange, very glaring bloodstain on the forehead of the face on the shroud. When looking at the cloth itself, the bloodstain looks like the Greek letter epsilon. However, in order for that bloodstain to have been made, the way it would have looked on the man of the shroud's forehead to an observer would have been as the number 3. The imprimatur of God, yes. Are all of these fanciful observations that are nothing more than strange coincidences, or as Giulio Fanti would say, God incidences? Or is it God making a repeated effort to announce who and what Jesus of Nazareth is? We are given eyes to see, but some will avert their gaze. As C.S. Lewis said of God, he cannot ravish, he can only woo. This is God's self-imposed restraint that preserves our God-given right to refuse him. During Jesus' crucifixion, there are multiple streams of evidence that go towards proving that a very strange darkness overtook the land from noon until Jesus' death at 3 p.m. We are informed of this through the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Additionally, this was all foretold in the book of Amos with regard to the day of the Lord, which is not just in reference to any one particular day, but it refers to a time of God's judgment. In Amos, it warns that the day of the Lord will be a day of darkness without a ray of brightness. Additionally, it states that with regard to God's divine judgment, the Lord has sworn that he will make the sun go down at noon to darken the earth in the daytime, and that the earth will quake. And God will make it a time of mourning for an only son. Is this not what we have at Jesus' crucifixion? God the Father mourning his only begotten Son on the day of the Lord, Judgment Day, where the Son atones for the sins of all of humanity? The non-Christian Greek historian Phlegon of Tralles, who was born around 80 AD, wrote about the darkness that overtook the land during Jesus' crucifixion in his seminal work, The Olympiads. Although none of the manuscripts to this work still exist, they survive in the manuscripts of others such as Sextus Julius Africanus, George Syncellus, and others. Regarding the darkness, Origen, in his famous work that I mentioned earlier, Against Celsus, wrote, "And with regard to the eclipse in the time of Tiberius Caesar, in whose reign Jesus appears to have been crucified, and the great earthquakes which then took place." Philippon, in the 6th century, he's a Christian philosopher and theologian. He said the following about the very strange darkness during Jesus' crucifixion from his work on the creation of the world. And I quote, "Phlegon mentioned the eclipse which took place during the crucifixion of the Lord Christ, and no other eclipse. It is clear that he did not know from his sources about any similar eclipse in previous times, and this is shown by the historical account itself of Tiberius Caesar." In Justin Martyr's first apology that was written in the middle of the 2nd century, he made a defense of Christianity to the Emperor Antoninus Pius, where he quoted what Pontius Pilate said about the darkness at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. It should be noted that the emperor would obviously have easily been able to access these acts of Pilate himself. So it would be absurd to think that Justin Martyr would have been making false claims about the content of Pilate's writing. Justin Martyr quoted Pontius Pilate's mentioning the following comments with regard to the exceedingly strange occurrences that took place during Jesus' crucifixion. And I quote, "And at the time he was crucified, there was darkness all over the world, the sun being darkened at midday, and the stars appearing, but in them were no luster, and the moon, as if it turned to blood, failed in her light. And in that terror, dead men were seen that had risen, as the Jews themselves had testified. And the fear of the earthquake remained from the 6th hour, which is noon, of the preparation until the 9th hour, which would be 3 p.m. With regard to the earthquake that also is reported to have occurred during Jesus' crucifixion, a 2012 study published by geologist Jefferson Williams in the International Geology Review reports that sediment analyzed from the Dead Sea confirms that a seismic event occurred between 26 and 36 AD. In Tertullian's Apologeticus, written around AD 197, he referred to the darkness during Jesus' crucifixion as an omen, and he asserted that an independent account of this darkness was contained in the Roman archives. And I quote, "And yet, nailed upon the cross, he exhibited many notable signs by which his death was distinguished from all others. At his own free will, he, with a word, dismissed him his spirit, anticipating the executioner's work. In the same hour, too, the light of day was withdrawn, when the sun at the very time was in his meridian blaze. Those who were not aware that this had been predicted about Christ, no doubt thought it an eclipse. You yourselves have the account of the world portent still in your archives." Dionysius the Areopagite. In the book of Acts, Luke gives an account of the Apostle Paul's traveling to Athens, which was the intellectual capital of the Roman world. While there, Paul began preaching about Jesus and his resurrection to the Jews there in the synagogue, to the philosophers, and to the people in the marketplace. The Athenians were very interested in what Paul was saying, and they brought him to the Areopagus, which was a hilltop in Athens, which the Romans refer to it as Mars Hill. And here the philosophers would debate in front of large audiences. Paul proceeded to tell the people that the God who created the world and everything in it wants us to seek him. Paul preached that while God overlooked the ignorance of earlier times, he now commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man who he has appointed. And of this he has given assurances to all by raising him from the dead. While some in the audience mocked the concept of resurrection, the book of Acts specifies that one man that was listening to him was Dionysius the Areopagite, who then came to believe in the Christian God that Paul was talking about. So, who is this Dionysius? Well, he was a Greek lawyer and a judge who in Athens sat on the Areopagus Council, which is similar to the Supreme Court in the United States. And the Areopagus Hill is right next to the Acropolis. After he became a Christian and spent several years evangelizing with Paul, Paul then made Dionysius Bishop of Athens. And the Athenian philosopher Aristides reports that Dionysius died a martyr for Christ. There are 4 books and 10 letters by Dionysius which are extant. There are those who claim that these writings are not authentic and that they are written by pseudo-Dionysius. However, the newest evidence from a book that just came out, as well as a paper by Evangelos Nikitopoulos and Craig Trulia, gives a strong defense for the authenticity of the Dionysian corpus by responding to those who argue that they are inauthentic. Among these letters, which are authentic and have been shown to be so, there is one from Dionysius to Polycarp. Dionysius recalls the very bizarre and extremely memorable occurrence that he and his friend Apollophanes witnessed together while studying astronomy in Hierapolis, Egypt, which is about 226 miles away from Jerusalem. And this occurred about 17 years before Dionysius's first encounter with the Apostle Paul in Athens. In his letter to Polycarp, Dionysius discusses how Apollophanes continues to be resistant to worshiping God despite their seeing what they saw together in Hierapolis, Egypt. Here is what Dionysius wrote to Polycarp in its pertinent part. Apollophanes, being a wise man, ought to recognize that nothing could otherwise be removed from its heavenly course and movement if it had not the sustainer and cause of its being moved thereto. How then does he not worship him when sun and moon, together with the universe, by a power and stability most supernatural, were fixed by them to entire immobility, and for a measure of a whole day, all the constellations stood in the same places. Say to him, however, what do you affirm concerning the eclipse which took place at the time of this saving cross? For both of us at that time at Heliopolis, being present and standing together, saw the moon approaching the sun to our surprise, for it was not appointed time for conjunction. And again, from the 9th hour to the evening, supernaturally placed back again into a line opposite the sun. And remind him also of something further, for he knows that he saw, to our surprise, the contact itself beginning from the east and going towards the edge of the sun's disk, then receding back again. Both the contact and the reclearing not taking place from the same point, but from that diametrically opposite, and possible to Christ alone, the cause of all, who worketh great things and marvelous, of which there is not a number. If occasion serves, and if possible, O Apollophanes, refute them, and to me, who was then both present with thee, and saw, and judged, and wondered with thee at them all. And in truth, Apollophanes begins prophesying at that time, and to me he said, these things are requitals of divine deeds. It's of vital importance to note that Jesus was crucified on Preparation Day for Passover, which always occurs during a full moon. And a full moon happens when the earth is positioned between the sun and the moon. During a solar eclipse, the moon passes between the sun and earth, blocking the sun's light, and this can, if one is speaking to what naturally occurs during a new moon. As such, because Dionysius, who again was in Egypt studying astronomy, knew that when he saw the sun's light being eclipsed by the moon, he knew, and later noted in his letter to Polycarp, that this was a violation of the laws of nature. And he noticed many more violations of the laws of nature, with the moons eclipsing the sun from the wrong direction. He saw the moon moving from east to west. But when we observe a solar eclipse, we see the moon moving from west to east. But this was not all. Normally, as the moon moves west to east in order to cause a solar eclipse, when the solar eclipse is complete, the moon would just continue to move west to east. But this didn't happen. Dionysius and his friend observed that at the end of the eclipse, the moon bizarrely changed directions and went backwards. But still, this was not all. A total solar eclipse can last anywhere from 10 seconds to a maximum of 7.5 minutes. Dionysius once again saw another violation of the laws of nature when he saw an eclipse lasting 3 hours, from noon until 3 in the afternoon. But how can this be? But our astronomer Dionysius's keen eye noted still more violations of the laws of nature in the sky. During the strange darkness that he observed, he could observe the constellations during that time. So it couldn't have been a dust storm that darkened the sky. Yet he noted that the constellations remained fixed for the rest of the day. Normally, When one is standing at a fixed point and observing the constellations in the sky, the constellations will not appear to remain fixed. Instead, they will appear to move due to the Earth's rotation on its axis. And so, when Dionysius was listening to Paul's preaching at the Areopagus or Mars Hill, and he learned that a strange darkness overtook the land from noon to 3 in the afternoon during Jesus' crucifixion, Dionysius remembered the numerous astonishing things that he had witnessed in the sky in Egypt about 17 years before. And so he knew that the things that Paul was saying about Jesus were true. And so Dionysius, he saw, he learned, and then he believed. We have extra-biblical corroboration with many pertinent facts about Jesus of Nazareth in the Gospels. We have Josephus, the first-century Jewish military commander and historian, who wrote the best accounts of Jewish history during antiquity in the Roman Empire. And he wrote the following famous passage, which is known as the Testimonium Flavianum, about Jesus of Nazareth in his monumental work, The Antiquity of the Jews. He said, "There was in those times Jesus, a wise man, if really it is right to call him a man. He said that he was a doer of miraculous works and the teacher of men that were gladly hearing things that he was true." And I'm running short on time, so I want to just quickly reference that although the Testimonium Flavianum is highly contested, a brand new book has just come out by the New Testament scholar Thomas C. Schmidt. It is such an important book. It just came out. It's in England. It's not even available in the United States, but a very generous donor made it to where this book is free to all the world on the internet. It's available right now if you Google Josephus and Jesus by Thomas C. Schmidt. Some important details about the shroud that we want to get into. And this is a non-exhaustive list, and I'm going to run through it quickly. And are we on time? Is that 15 minutes left? How much time do we have? 5 minutes. Do I have time?
You can go to 10:50, but that would be no question.
Okay, I'll try to speed through. So some important details concerning the Shroud of Turin. Aged bloodstains that remain reddish in color instead of turning brownish in color. An absence of capillary flow or cementation with the fibers in the pure body image areas of the cloth. The actual photographic negative of the shroud, as in Secondo Pia's photographic plate, reveals an image that appears more detailed and more like the natural face of a man to the naked eye, compared to what is seen with the naked eye when viewing the image on the cloth itself, or a traditional positive photograph of the cloth itself. The body image on the cloth is extremely superficial and is contained within the top 1 to 3 fibers of thread in the cloth, with the thread being composed of approximately 100 to 200 linen fibers. The straw yellow color of the body image is strikingly uniform in color, and this is also confirmed by a densitometric study of photographic images of the shroud with less than 2% variation in the absorbance of the individual colored body image fibers. The image contains no brushstrokes and has no sense of directionality and is neither a finger painting nor a powder rubbing. The body image on the shroud is encoded with 3-dimensional information regarding actual depth or remoteness, which, unlike an albedo image, such as a photograph, is capable of producing a three-dimensional effect of an overall undistorted anatomical human form on the screen of a VP8 image analyzer. Evidence that the very superficial body image in the facial image on frontal body image exhibits double superficiality, in that it can be quite strangely detected, albeit to a lesser extent, on the opposite side of the cloth. There's no snow fencing of pigment as exists with powder rubbings or finger paintings. No fluorescence of the body image under ultraviolet light, as would be the case if the body image were a typical scorch mark. The body image is not visually perceptible with any real sense of clarity unless one observes it from a distance of at least about 1 meter, yet it fades from visibility at a distance of approximately 30 feet. No outlines forming the body. Chemical tests evidence that the shroud was first stained with blood, through a contact process before the body image was formed through a process that does not require contact. Dumbbell-shaped markings which appear like wounds from a scourge with leaden balls attached to or scattered over both body images and exhibit finely detailed scratch marks which are visible under ultraviolet light, but which are invisible in visible light. Pale white fluorescences in the margins of these dumbbell-shaped marks are visible under UV light, but invisible in visible light. And these white fluorescences are similar to the white fluorescences around the margins of the much heavier bloodstains, which evidence points to there being serum halos derived from the blood clots. Evidence of a body in a state of rigor mortis and cadaveric spasm. I'm going, and so how much time do I have? 10 minutes? Or? A little less than 3 minutes. 3, okay. So for someone to reproduce the body image, that's not going to happen. It hasn't been done, and I think I'd bet everything that it will never be done. So one thing that I want to say in conclusion, let us never think of the Holy Shroud as merely some ancient artifact, because it is infinitely more than that. This cloth has the body and the blood of Christ on it, and it's the Holy Eucharist in another form. It's consumed through our eyes and digested in our hearts and minds. And it should always be treated with the respect that it deserves. Because the images on the Holy Shroud are the evidence that the things that the Gospels say about Jesus and what Jesus is and everything that he claimed is true. Jesus of Nazareth was and is a truth teller. The Holy Shroud is the imprimatur of God on the Gospel's message to us about Jesus of Nazareth's divinity. There has yet to be another burial cloth like this one. There has yet to be another image like this one. And I have ironclad confidence that there never will be, because it is absurd to think that a miracle could be reproduced by mere man. The message of God through the Holy Shroud is very straightforward. Here is my body. Here is my blood. I am showing you that I am real. I am here. And I am with you. And come to me. Amen. Thank you.
Teddi will be outside the hall. We're going to break for lunch in about 10 minutes, but Teddi will be out in the hall if you want to ask any questions. Yes.
10-second comment for the edification of the speaker and the room. Most of you know I'm broadcasting on social media as a credit to you and your fellow speakers this morning. I've had a response I've never seen. We're hitting 111,000.
Wow.
Thank you. Thank you.